Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the Festival Director. FODI is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival based in Sydney, Australia, that aims to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. FODI gathers the world's best experts, innovative thinkers and mischief makers to provoke and inspire curious minds. The culture wars are seeping out of the real world and infiltrating our pages and stages. Art has always traversed unfamiliar and even dangerous territory, but with recent calls to boycott cultural institutions, donors pulling funding and the cancellation of works and talent are some discussions too fraught to engage with. Join Director of Adelaide Writers Festival Louise Adler, visual artist and FODI First Nations curatorial advisor Brook Garru Andrew, actor, writer and director Violette Ayad, CEO of Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras Gil Beckwith, and film and television producer Emile Sherman, as they examine Australia's current state of heightened sensitivity in the arts. This is the 2024 session, Art is Always Political, chaired by philosopher and Executive Director of the Ethics Centre, Simon Longstaff.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Simon Longstaff. I'm the Executive Director of the Ethics Centre and co-founder with Richard Evans of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, and I'd like to welcome you all here this afternoon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands we meet. For tens of thousands of years they've been caring for country, for the things seen and unseen from the land, the sea and the air, and they've held them in trust for everybody who lives here on and of the country. And so I'd like, on behalf of us all, to pay our respects to their elders, past and present. And just pause for a moment too and just think about that long period and the gift that we're all offered of belonging. I'd also like to say, in welcoming you all, that as you see we're in a conversation amongst us as a group, and I'll introduce people in a second, but there will be an opportunity at the end for people to ask questions too of this group, probably just stepping into the light with a microphone so you're seen. There's one fewer than we may have expected. Unfortunately, Declan Green has COVID and so cannot be with us. It's kind of a sign of the times in which we live. But we're joined by a really interesting group of people. And I'll say a bit more about the general makeup of our group in a moment, but I'll just give people to give themselves a little bit of a wave as we go through. Louise Adler, who's here. Louise loves dangerous ideas. She sort of made a life of it. She's also joined by actor, writer, dramaturg Violette Ayad, sorry, I mispronounced your name. Then we have Gil Beckwith. Gil has been heading up Mardi Gras for how long now, Gil?
I've been there for a year. I'm the CEO for a year, but I've been with the organisation for over 5 years.
For a long time. Declan, I mentioned, can't be with us. Brook Andrew, artist, who's actually been a really substantial contributor to FODI the last time we were here, so thank you and welcome back, Brook, through your work and support. And Emile Sherman, who is a filmmaker, producer and a good friend of the Ethics Centre over many, many years, as his family have been as well. So I'd like to welcome everybody here. We've got old relationships, new relationships in the group. I think one thing to acknowledge as we start is that this is an incredibly sensitive topic about art, not just because of the particular moment in history, but because there has always been a situation in which artists, in relation to the societies in which they operate, have both been a very powerful influence in the world, whilst simultaneously often being some of the most powerless people, standing beside or outside society, coming from groups which have often been marginalised and looked down. So when we talk about this issue about art, politics, the role of the artist, please, as we do that, bear in mind that for some people, the position they take in this isn't just a rhetorical position which has no effect. It can actually lead to losses of employment, shunning, marginalisation, and that's a deeply personal burden to bear, whilst at the same time being driven to engage in the world. So I think maybe on that note, I'd be open to starting with a bit of discussion about that relationship of power, because there's power in different distributions between people who fund the arts, make the art, attend as audiences or consumers of it, contribute to. So there's a whole lot of different things, and they're not always entirely clear. So who wants to kick off with something about that? Have got any volunteers in the group, or should I nominate someone? First exercise of power.
Go on, Brooke. Off you go.
Oh, the group's you've dobbed in Brooke.
Okay, yama everyone. What was the question?
Come on. Don't play.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that as an artist myself, you know, often, well, just from my perspective, and we were talking about this before, like as a little group, and it was really wonderful for us all to sit here and have this moment together before you all joined us. And people kind of have this kind of maybe, well, I certainly feel it, a perception about what is an artist. And often we're kind of catapulted out into the world, regardless if you see us on a magazine or you see our artwork somewhere, and we're kind of often either elevated or not, but like we're kind of objectified. But really within my own world as an artist, I think that there are multiple different kinds of artists. So if we look at Emily Ngawarai, who's now deceased, but the Aranta woman from out Uluru, you know, incredible famous artist who paints yam dreaming, and of course her works can be used in land claims. For Indigenous land. And then we have Ai Weiwei giving the finger to the state. I mean, and the kind of trauma he's actually went through, regardless if he's got a lot of money or not. And then my own practice, looking at everything from the return of Aboriginal human remains to, God, what are the same, you know, kind of really looking at historical events, regardless if they're contemporary or not. And I think that often we hold that close to ourselves, and it's exposed. And so even when I'm sitting here, or my mum and dad ask me what I'm doing, my own personality is I'm actually quite humbled by it, not because it's a thing I think about, it's because I need to contain it within myself, because I know that it can be a very vulnerable place to be in. And so the way I deal with it is I meditate, or I have other practices, or I have a very strong community that helps me kind of deal with that space. And in saying that doesn't mean I'm miserable all the time. I'm very passionate, of course, but I think it's a complicated space.
Is it the vulnerabilities to do with making the work and the burden or the legacy of history of what you owe to other First Nations people, your community? Is that what makes you feel vulnerable?
Well, I think like most creative people, I'm curious about the world. So growing up, if we look at the Australian education system, and we look at ethnographic photographs, for example, of Aboriginal people. I mean, this was really not popular, or people didn't even know that they existed, even my community didn't, until I would even say the late 90s, 2000s, which, depending on what generation you are in the room, this is actually still quite recent. And so if we look at Pol Pot, and if we look at the killing fields and the museums there, those photos are on display. So those kind of legacies around genocide are on display. In this country, it's only entered into museums in probably the last 10 years, if that. And so I think that it's not that there's an owing to anything. I think that there's a curiosity of like, well, if you're going to expose this, what is it? And what kind of rabbit hole are you going to go down? And often I don't necessarily think about my own safety straight up first, but I would say recently, with what's going on in the world, is definitely a lot more heightened care around that.
Violette, one of the things, we were talking before about framing this, and in an earlier email, I sought to make a distinction between art as political, namely the works and things like that, as opposed to the artist being political beyond the work itself. So, you know, activists in one things taking on political causes and things like that. I was writing that notion and thinking about that distinction. I say, actually, is this really a valid one? I mean, I know it makes kind of analytical sense, but is it so easy to distinguish between the work? Because you're an actor, so I suppose you come along to a play and it's invested, a Crucible or something, any play you pick, it's got a political position because it's come out of the world and the world is political. But do you make that distinction between the art and the artist?
There's a few different lines there, I think. The first one being like the art and the artist. So let's talk about that. I'm going to talk about it just from the perspective of being an actor. Is like the literal job that you are being hired to do is bring your experience and your background and the way you view the world to the text. And so in that case, it's completely, impossible to draw a distinction because your background and the way you view the world is formed in a society which is political. So the work itself, like what you're doing in the room and how you rehearse and what you bring, your creativity, I think is inextricably linked to who you are, which is inextricably linked to politics. The other distinction of politics poetically within the arts versus more prosaically outside of the arts is interesting. I think it does link to power as well, though, like what we were just talking about before, because it's, again, I'm just going to speak from my very specific perspective, but in the hierarchy of a theatre company, when you're hired as an actor, you are disempowered in that you're in this sort of gig economy space where you're not part of the company. You're not a full-time employee of the company. The conversations about what is programmed and who is cast are not transparent ones. So, yeah, the risks are great. You don't know if somebody goes, gosh, that person was incredibly difficult for bringing this problem to us, and thus we will just never work with them again. So that's a consequence, which, fine. But then I was thinking actually this morning when we were coming in about Nicola Coughlan wearing her ceasefire pin to all of her media press work, which is work, right? That's not just what she does in her spare time. And that the power difference for her, say, than other actors is that she's got power. The reason why that's not being questioned is that she has this star quality of like, you can't make the show without me. And so that's power, right? And that is why she has been able to do that to no question. So I think the power structures are going to be incredibly different depending on the workplace. I think the MSO compared to what happened to us at STC is interesting because the orchestra can have a vote of no confidence because they are employed by the company. We couldn't do anything. I mean, we could all
Because you don't have any formal status within the structure, is that it?
Well, no, yeah. Like, we could be like, we'll never work here again. And they're like, okay. But, like, that's not... do you know what I mean? Like, we're not going to all band together and no one ever work... I mean, we could. Actually. but
you heard it here first, like, everybody.
You're an employee on a contract basis. And it's one of those vulnerabilities of the gig economy that is... historically something.
So when you go in we'll stick with the formal contract part for the moment. When you go in, do you think that there are boundaries as to what you do and don't do under that contract? Or, I mean, you're obviously there to perform the role, but... Yes,
of course. Yeah. And this is kind of where the conversation happened with the company of like, are you damaging the company? And have you signed something that says you can't damage the company? Right. What does that mean? It was quite difficult when the company didn't of itself have a manifesto or an ethical stance, because then you don't know. Like, frankly, we didn't know what we did would be out of line with the company, nor was it out of line with the company, really, considering they gave me permission to do it.
Right.
So it's an incredibly confusing thing, right? You've asked for permission, they said you can do it, and then they've later gone, wait, hold on, does that sit with... I don't know, man, it's your company, does it? Like, let us know before we sign up to work.
You want to jump in?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about that boundary between the artist and the work, and I felt like there's a sort of contract of trust there that's implicit with an audience, and I think it really differs depending on what sort of artistic practice we're talking about. So if you go and see a rock and roll concert, you know that you're going to see, maybe a singer there, and they're going to be able to talk about what they want to talk about in between the songs.
Peter Garrett would be a great example.
You've bought into that. And a comedian, they're going to say, you don't have control. And so you've accepted that sort of offer by coming there. I think if you go to a classical music concert and the third violinist gets up at the end with, abortion is murder, you're probably going to feel like that contract of trust might be, a little bit broken, and you might lose trust in the organisation. And I think the question of actors at the end of a performance, I think it's been an interesting one because it's sort of pushed. Some people have one response, some people have another response.
Well, John Bell and Neil Armfield have two very different views about the curtain call, which we might come back to, which is, I think, where you're talking to.
And how I try to think about it when I go firstly, did it break a contract of trust, but was it appropriate or not, is to go, let's not think, to try to think about a viewpoint that, I would be very opposed to. So how would, because I think that's the difference between, do I believe in a political view, an opinion, or do I have a principle? And I think to have trust in these artistic organisations, we need to, and I think that's what we're trying to do here a little bit, is to help work through some principles. So if someone did come up at the end with abortion is murder, I stand with the millions of unborn babies, how would we feel about that? And if the answer is we feel confronted and uncomfortable, but ultimately we respect that that's their ability to do that, that's their role to do that, then I think we've got a principle there. If we're just happy to see things that we agree with, then we're just sort of happy to be part of an ideology. And so I sometimes forget to do that with myself, but whenever I do flip the viewpoint, that's when I reveal whether I'm thinking in a principled way or a political way.
So because I completely agree. We have to take our personal perspectives on things out of it sometimes to create a viewpoint. I do think we can distinguish, though, between what is hate speech or incites violence versus what doesn't, and that's fine. I think I would like it so that people would get up and expose themselves. I'd like to know if somebody had a viewpoint that was...
Third violin in the orchestra?
Absolutely. I want to know. I want to know that I never go see that person's concert again. Like, I actually want to... Do you know what I mean? Like, I'd prefer that it wasn't... that they were harbouring these incredibly insidious views, and the only reason why I don't know that is because they feel they can't... is that there's like a protection almost. Like, if somebody from the arts community wanted to come up and say something anti-trans or something... say it. I want to know, and I want us all to know that that's what you think. Like, let's expose that. So for my money, it's on everyone say the thing.
Wow, you've been touching what's been a really sore point so far in the festival too, about just what to say and not say.
I think that can result in incredibly conformist groups then.
Maybe.
Because it's like the audience who believes in certain trans views goes to that group which has those trans views, and the audience that believes in certain views about immigration goes to that one. And then if we want arts organisations to thrive and to fulfil their mission, which is great art, then there needs to be some form of boundary around that, and to be able to go to a performance knowing that we're there to see, Beethoven's Third, or to see a performance of a play or whatever it is, and to have a sort of trust relationship with the audience.
Can you explain a bit more about what you think trust with an audience means? Because I'm not sure that I understand.
Well, I think, if you go to... I think it's sort of quite intuitive as a human being, and I think, if you go to a performance, if you come here, assuming we're in an artistic performance, maybe we are...
I'd love to think that.
I'd like to think that. People should expect that any view could be aired, and they could be in a place of feeling triggered or distressed that could bring up things that are very... But if you go to see I went to see the Australian Chamber Orchestra recently. If they went and suddenly the cellist gets up and starts spruiking a view, I'd say that sits outside of the trust relationship with the audience. And I would have thought most people would agree.
I thought art see it a challenge.
Yeah. Well, I think that sits outside the art.
But it could be.
What is outside art? What does it mean to be outside art? It's actually a
when I'm doing my dishes, that's outside art.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
When I'm doing my dishes, that's outside art. There's a lot of things that are outside art.
Or is it outside of art?
Sorry?
Outsider art, don't do that. Don't land in that.
Okay, just hold for a sec, Gil.
I was going to say, coming from my community, the work that artists have done have actually changed lives, and I think that's really important. If you think about ACT UP during the 90s, around the AIDS 100%. Crisis, they changed the world. They changed how treatments happened, how people's lives were saved, and Mardi Gras is born on being creative and artistic and being activists. So we have changed the world. So I can sit here as an older lesbian person and have this conversation with you. And I think that's really important.
And art has made that possible, correct?
Exactly.
Along with other
passion and all
commitment and political action.
And
Do you think it's to do... I'm just really interested in this question about the contract of trust and whether or not there are, in fact, certain conventions then that are governing this. So I remember...
Sure, when you go to a classical music concert, you go out and your husband falls asleep and you come back
it didn't used to be that. I remember reading about, I think it was 18th century concerts where the audience is chatting away and they're doing this and that.
Throwing
and then all
tomatoes.
of a sudden orchestras become sacred spaces where no one's allowed to blow their nose or speak. And so in that kind of convention, I reckon it might strike a lot of people as a bit odd if the cellist stood up and started spouting whatever it was. But perhaps it wasn't always, and maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe our conventions are wrong.
And the art that we're talking about is actually elitist, is for privileged folk who get to sit in an audience at $150 a pop and go, oh my God, that was great. Talk to the neighbour, that was great. And they go home and they do it next week. How's that trying to change the world?
I don't want to just like be like at you real this whole time, but I wonder.
I accepted that coming into this space.
I wonder, because what you're saying is super valid. Like that is the response from the community, and I do think we have to listen to it and understand it. And because what are we doing then? We're just like pushing a bunch of people away from the theatre, and I don't want to be doing that. But I wonder then where that places something like the acknowledgement of country, which sits outside of a show, which is political, even though maybe we've like gotten to a point where we've forgotten that, which would be good actually if we got to a point where we felt that that was no longer political or something. But if we'd done that maybe like 40 years ago, would that be considered in a similar vein? Too political to have space?
And it didn't take 40 years ago. It wasn't just 40 years ago. The people thought it was offensive, and they're still making cracks about how inappropriate it is to have an acknowledgement to country.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, they're still objecting to it. They're still thinking that's a breach, and you know, you're shoving your kind of First Nations politics down our throat. I mean, those jokes go on and on and on.
And like, what are we supposed to do? Is there meant to be like TW trigger warning? There will be an acknowledgement of country, or there will be a speech. Like,
Well, that's going to be hard because Qantas is doing it everywhere now.
right. Trigger warning. Get on a plane.
Well, no, they're like doing acknowledgement to country, you know, and I think that the interesting thing that you were saying before is really we're talking about class. And these are all the kind of like big words, really, that we're all kind of a bit scared to talk about. We're talking about prejudice, class, racism, homophobia. You know, you're talking about abortion. I would personally love it if I went to an orchestra. Not that I go to many, because quite frankly I can't really afford them, or it's not my culture that I come from. That if someone did get up and I wouldn't actually care if I agreed with what they said or not. It's breaking the convention. And I think what you mentioned before about, okay, yes, back in the 18th century, I mean, we're in Australia, okay? Back in the 18th century, if we look at the historical records of Australia, Hyde Park up the road was actually a very important, it was like a, you know, I don't know, it was like an Olympics, you know, and all the early convicts would get involved, and there would be Aboriginal people throwing spears and people would be betting on each other. It was just like everyday society, right? And so that really is the kind of like the place you're talking about, and people would be getting up saying, well, actually, you know, I believe in this and I believe in that. And I'm not trying to be abstract, it's just that I don't think we necessarily have the tools or the imagination to think that these other things actually existed in this place where we live.
Now, Louise, I haven't really given you a chance to sort of flesh out whether you see there's a difference between the work, the role of the artist as a citizen, if you like, and how those things intersect. And I got the sense that you think the boundaries are too sharply drawn, given what you were saying in response to Emil's idea. Is that where you're thinking, or is it something different?
Well, I don't know. I think, you know, because my business work is, you know, the literary culture more than, you know, the more visual arts or the performing arts. And, you know, I think I talked about this in another context about an anthology that was started in response to the Spanish Civil War in 1937 of English publishers asking a range of writers to write on the subject of authors take sides. And that anthology, unfortunately, because of, you know, how many successive wars and, you know, horrors have we seen, that anthology or that, you know, conceit has been republished and repackaged, if you liked, 4 times. MUP, we contributed to that anthology during the Iraq War, and I remember ringing up Frank Morehouse, the late great Frank Morehouse, and asking him who would contribute, and his attitude, and so the title of the anthology is Authors Take Sides, and he said to me, why aren't you asking dentists to take sides? And I said to him, well, you haven't met my dentist, you know, so, you know, there's a reason he can't write to save his life. So, for example, you know, he might be good at teeth, but, you know, writing's not his thing.
What a great project, Dentists Take Sides.
I mean, you can see it's a real winner, it's a real bestseller, Dentists Take Sides, right? Anyway, it's like pilots taking sides, it's almost scary. But in the end, of course, he contributed. So my issue is, I think artists always take sides. You know, and even when you determine not to take a side, that is taking a side. And I think that's what we ask of artists. And, you know, I was thinking while you were talking about the contract and trust, and you think of Bertolt Brecht, the whole thing was to break the divide, to disrupt the divide between, you know, artists, you know, completely, it's a vacuum, it's a kind of, you know, a perfect thing here, and we the audience are recipients of that work. That's not the that's not what's happening, you know.
But are we not a little bit sympathetic just to the human fact that sometimes we do have certain expectations about the context of the place we walk into, and it can be a bit of a shock. Now, it may be a good shock, but it can also be a bit of the unexpected nature that you wander into a library, I don't know, and you suddenly find a choir, nobody, you know, singing away. You might be a bit surprised.
Don't we want that? Don't we want to be tested?
Well, this is what I wanted to... Well, do we want that?
But are we so frightened of being unsafe or being asked to think again about what we think or to think differently? Or, you know, let me... You know, I remember the kerfuffle, I wasn't here, but the kerfuffle over the STC and the 3 actors who take their curtain call with a keffiyeh. Well, apparently everybody, I've spoken to umpteen people who were there, nobody went out into the foyer and was huffing and puffing. That response came later, the response to this. What is triggering, you know, the fear of being triggered? I mean, we use this word as if all of, you know, the condition of mental health, we are so fragile in and of ourselves that we can't bear being provoked, asked to think differently, anew, afresh about, you know, the world we're living in and artists and what they make of that world, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think challenging those boundaries and those norms is fantastic, and it's a key part of what art is about. I don't think artists have a monopoly on opinions. I think their opinion is probably worth as much as a dentist.
Well, I don't think that's
their
correct.
opinion in artwork is incredibly powerful and interesting, but their
and more
opinion
important
on a particular geopolitical issue is probably similar level to dentists. But I do think that challenging of the boundaries and, in a sense, the sort of whole performance piece that we're part of here, of discussing how those boundaries are changed, how they've been challenged, what donors have done. I mean, you could read the whole thing as a sort of artistic performance piece where the boundary between the artwork and the sort of artistic...
Except that a whole bunch of people had to be sacked from the STC because they lost a ton of money. They lost $1.5 million.
Sure,
so there are consequences.
Sure, and there is money and capital and a lot at stake in art all around. My main point is just that we need to work through principles, and if the principle is that we go into a theatre space and it's fine and we expect that that artists can display their political allegiances, then that's great.
So when the MSO...
And it just needs to be applied equally to all minority groups.
Right. I'd like I'll be quick. So when the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra says it's a contravention of the trust, I'm sure they don't use your language, they didn't use your language, but let's call it a contravention of the trust, is we don't accept artists, a pianist, coming on stage, introducing a piece called Witness about the journalist in Gaza having been killed, and that's inappropriate. Even though later in the program he actually talked about Ligeti and the fact that his own family, that composer's family had been murdered in the Holocaust. So you think that's appropriate, that the principle, and it's a matter of principle now for the MSO, is that, you know, there should be no politics. This is not a place for politics. It's inappropriate for a pianist to contextualise the piece he's going to perform.
Yeah, I don't have a particular opinion. I mean, it sounds reasonable that if you're going to see a lead musician and they're going to be talking, that they should be able to do that. But I don't think the important response is in where exactly we draw the line. It's that the line is drawn in a principled way that applies to everyone, to all reasonable political views that are not hate speech, that are not illegal, but sit within the boundary of being sort of reasonable, passionate political views, that they're all held. And that if we do that, I think arts groups are going to be able to reach a broader group of people, and they'll actually end up being more powerful artistically, because they'll, instead of being often talking to themselves in a sort of echo chamber, they'll be able to be, and hopefully this is what's happening here, is talking across viewpoints.
Let's pause this because I want to come to Gil. It's on the same sort of point, but it's just a different dimension. I was struck before we started this session of you talking about the care with which you have to hold a community.
Yes.
And I wonder whether or not, because there is very real history of vulnerability and oppression.
Violence.
All those things.
All those things.
And so would you...
Trauma.
If somebody popped up who had created an artwork and in that context wanted to say something which was damaging to the community, how would you deal with it? Would you think that they'd breached trust and faith with your organisation to take that?
Are you saying from within the community that?
Within or whatever.
Yeah.
But let's a person who says, I'm going to use Mardi Gras as a platform now to say something which they might sincerely believe, but really objectively is likely to be quite damaging to people.
It's interesting. I think the Mardi Gras, the community is very, very diverse, and there are very polar, opinions about things.
Do you ever hear from them?
Yes, constantly. I'm probably going to. There is currently a consultation happening about the police and parade. I'm going to talk about it because it's in the room. Everyone knows it's going on, but there are varying. It's like this, and because people have very strong opinions about it. But I think for me personally, and I'm going to talk personally, is that trying to find the way which is the safest way to hear these opinions and to try and find a common ground. And I think for all this discussion here, for me, it's about being in the room and having the discussion. And I think the frightening thing is that people get shut out of the room or decide not to walk into the room. And that then means there's a whole voice not being heard. And to have a voice, particularly in my community, takes a long time to get that voice. You're either shut down by your family or your school or the bullies or anybody else or your church, and you can't find that voice, and it takes you a long time to find that voice. And so to be shut down and basically not validated or seen is so damaging. So Mardi Gras holds itself up, not as well as it could, but to provide safe spaces for the community because it is so diverse. But we do have very, very polar opinions. And I know last year there was a piece of artwork that sort of happened around Mardi Gras, and this happens regularly. There's groups of people that will actually actively go out to be incredibly homophobic, full of hate speech during Mardi Gras to make people feel unsafe. A couple of years ago, they hit Newtown, hit King Street, and were throwing rotten fruit at people, eggs. This is, the day in the life of. So I think for any of us, or for me, I always want to think that I want to see it from, having a lived-in experience. So I want to walk a day in your shoes or your shoes because I want to be a better person from that.
What do you think of Emil's idea about a contract of trust that sets expectations in some ways? We'll come back to how it gets set because I'm a bit curious about who gets to decide it.
If I was thinking about that, because if Mardi Gras or the people that march and parade had said we're not going to challenge the status quo, the norm, we would not be here.
No, but I don't think that's a fair thing.
But that is about that contract
no, I think
of trust.
just to be clear, to give a fair view of what he's saying, I think tell me if I'm getting it wrong. It's not so much that it's just that if you know what it is that's going to happen within the envelope, then you've got a right to expect that, and that everybody expected Mardi Gras, I suppose, to be challenging the status quo is what. No one would expect Mardi Gras to take place in a way that affirms the conventional power arrangements.
Well, I actually suspect that no one expected Mardi Gras to be here. And interestingly enough, there's a conversation that I saw on Sky News today about the fact that Victoria's going for the Gay Games in 2030, and you should have seen the dump, the trolling about, oh my God, isn't there a straight games? I think that's called the Olympics. I don't know, but that kind of visceral hate reaction happens every day.
Can I jump in there? Because what you're sort of talking about there is consent, right? Consenting to a certain experience.
I think that's the problem I'm wanting to get to as to who decides where this boundary.
This is interesting because it's like necessarily the minority groups who come under a stricter scrutiny for consent of something than if you are part of the ruling status quo. Like, I just jotted down a few notes and I just wanted to tie them together because the way of not being an apolitical artist, there is no such thing. There's no such thing of existing. What you're doing is that the only way that you might appear to be an apolitical artist is to be so closely aligned and a benefactor of the current systems of power that it doesn't appear that you are political. But there's nothing apolitical about quietly upholding the status quo either. And I don't want to drag John Bell, but with his response, I think, to what we were doing last year where he was saying you should align yourself with the company, blah, 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 I do think it's particularly interesting that came from somebody who has only ever worked as an actor in companies he either started or has had a hand in starting or has had a lot of power in, right? So, of course, it's very easy to be apolitical when the politics suits you, first thing. But then the consent thing, it's like, well, okay, but why is this only applied when we're talking about groups of, like maybe an unpopular or a minority opinion. We don't walk around consenting every day to living in the white colonial state that we live in, or we don't ask people to. Like, that's interesting.
But I think that comes back to power too, right? And I think that that's the other thing that we're kind of skirting around a lot. I mean, we might be jumping in and out, but we're talking about companies or, you know, communities, etc. But I think that not all communities, regardless if you're vulnerable or not all artists or creative people are connected to the sort of things that we're talking about, right? It's a bit more fluid or a little bit more maybe vulnerable. And I think that it's the kind of shadow areas that we say, what art is political? Who is art for? Is it for the audience here? Is it for us? What do we go see? I mean, I just kind of think about, okay, I want to go to the Louvre to see, I don't know, a particular painting, or, you know, I mean, that's pretty prosaic as far as I'm concerned. I think that your point before about, like, you know, oh yeah, I want to walk into a library and I want to see a choir. I mean, I think that we can't forget that the reason why we are humans is that we want to be excited in life. And I think that stuff around care, you know, is really important. But I think that absolutely, you know, those, you know, the KISS kind of, you know, early...
86, 87.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, you know, of
sex campaigns.
Well, the sex campaigns. I mean, I remember as a
television.
Yes, in a child, and like, you know, the
number 96, wasn't it? Number 96.
I don't know, but like, you know, those who remember about
Joe Hashem or something.
I suppose what I'm trying to say is that, like, even like as an artist, my art dealer, like Jan Minchin from Talana Galleries in Melbourne. You know, when the war in Gaza started, right? Like, everyone's posting, yeah. And this is not just that. I mean, we talked about West Papua before. We talked about Sudan. You know, many things are happening in the world. Look at, you know, Venezuela at the moment. Oh my God, devastating. But, you know, she would protect me. She would say, "Hey, Brooke, someone said to me," and they called me up and said, "Oh, you shouldn't be posting this on social media." And it's like, okay. And she goes, "I'm not going to tell you who it is, but I want to let you know that I protect you." You know, and I don't think that all of us have this. And she wasn't going out, you know, posting it and reposting it. It's just that she has, you know, a responsibility because she believes in me and my practice, regardless if it challenges her or not, regardless who it challenges. And I think there's this thing around, notion around protection that I think is really important. And I don't think that all artists go out to be political. You know, I don't think that we all go out there and go, "I'm going to make a nightmare for you now," you know. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but I think that that's something that we also have to reflect on as well.
Emile, and then I want to go ask Louise about festival making. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just, because Violette, you talked about, you know, that very political nature of art, that art and politics are very connected. And I had a thought about that I just wanted to share, which might be controversial, so I thought might be helpful. Which is that, you know, politics and art are so intertwined. I'm talking now within the artworks itself, if we put aside the question of the boundary. And the political fuel that sort of enlivens artwork is so important to most artworks. And obviously, even artworks which are not fueled by political ambitions can be read in political contexts. But I was thinking more about that relationship, and, you know, I guess you talked about activism as well, and how we define some of these different forms. And that for me, and, you know, I'm in the world of film, television, storytelling, screen storytelling, the best artworks, the ones that do the most justice to the form, are the ones that are fueled by politics and by political energy, but are there to open up meaning, are there to find, sort of explore the messiness of humanity, using empathy and sensitivity, which we talked about a bit before, about how artists are, you know, you have that superpower of sensitivity and empathy. And so you can imagine yourself into different lives of people and viewpoints that you know, you don't have, and allows audiences into it. And sort of fuels interesting contradictions and surprising connections. But art which tries to close meaning down and is used to communicate a political viewpoint in a very reductive sense is essentially activism. And I have huge respect for activism, and we need activism. I just wouldn't call it art. You know, and there's a fusion, there's activist art. But I think, yeah, we all know that when we see something that nourishes us as humans because it surprises us and doesn't do doesn't reduce meaning to a very sort of simple political slogan, that's the best form of political art.
I don't agree with that. I mean, if we look at Caravaggio was very much looked down upon. I mean, he used prostitutes to represent the Virgin Mary. I mean, at this time, he's basically doing the sort of things that you disagree with. But now we're all like running to see a Caravaggio. We go, that's not a very good Caravaggio. You know, or why? The NGV's got all these Caravaggios on, you know? And I think that we cannot stop, you know, and I think that we just have to be able to express.
But what are you disagreeing about?
We have to be brave. Yeah. The audience has to be brave. There's no way that anyone in this room is going to go home to their family and agree with everything that their family agrees with. They're going to get shitty with them about the way they brush their teeth. They're going to be shitty with, you know, anything that's social, political, that might be high on your agenda or low on mine. I think this is what it is to be human, and I think that we are in a very urgent state in humanity at the moment, not only of the environment. I don't even have to go on about all of this, right? And I think that if we are not brave enough to protect each other and understand that we have differences of opinion, we are really in trouble.
Louise, as a publisher and as a maker of festivals and things, do you have in mind any boundaries at all for the artists who you bring into your things?
No hate speech, no vilification, civil discourse. I think civil discourse is really important, and we've been really pleased that, you know, in the last couple of years we've managed to bring in, you know, writers that parts of the community have objected to violently, have editorialised about, called for me to be sacked, called for the festival to be funding to be withdrawn by the state of Australia, South Australia, and so on and so forth. And despite all of that, we have managed to bring, this year was over 150,000 people together for civil, respectful listening and attending to ideas. And I think if there's anything we can, it's not my, you know, it's a collective, it's the community of, you know, readers that come together. It's nothing, no credit, it's nothing to do with me. It's the community of readers who actually have the capacity to listen to ideas that they may that they may deeply object to.
And how sensitive are you, or do you think you need to be, to the audience and its expectations and feelings? Do you think the audience has a voice?
They've got a choice. My view is we've got a choice. If I don't want to hear, an anti-abortionist, pro-fetus, whatever, I don't want to come. I'm not interested in your view. I think your view is banal. I think it's bullshit. I don't have to be there. Don't come. You have a choice. The punters that you don't want to hear Palestinians talking about the plight of, Palestinians. Don't come. Yeah. It's great. We live in a democracy. You've got a choice. Yeah.
Okay. And so are we agreed? We're trying to find the principle that this sounds like a pretty. No vilification, no hate, nothing that closes down the capacity for reasonable discussion. But within that, that's really total freedom for the person to express whatever they want, and then an audience decides whether to come or not to come. And I guess the trick would be if they don't know what's going to happen.
But it's also who says what those things are. We're saying, no hate speech, no vilification, nothing, whatever. But I think the confusion that we had, at least, was that, and, this is going to open up a can of worms, I'm sure, but, does the keffiyeh fit into that? Yeah, well, yes or no?
We're happy we just talk. Do you want to talk about the conversation we had before we started about whether you put out the keffiyeh or not?
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's a pretty pointed example.
Well, I feel like it opens up something that we should get to the bottom of, because I think this is it, right? And so I just asked the group before, do you mind if I put it on my chair? And me and Emil were talking about, is that different or the same as an Israeli flag? Where does that count as vilification or hate speech? Because
but you want to give an account of Emil's response too, I think, just so people know.
Yeah, what did Emil say?
What did Emil say?
He's here, you can ask him.
Well, you say it. You say. Well, do you want to say how you responded?
What was your response to the keffiyeh, to Violette's proposal that she put out her keffiyeh?
Well, I guess it goes back to my point about principles, that if we are genuinely concerned about how political signs and symbols are read by the group and groups that it affects, then we should be for all groups, and that the effect of that, knowing, of course, that any reasonable-minded and caring human being, in my view, has incredible empathy for the horrors going on in this war at the moment. So hopefully that's something that can just be taken as read amongst this audience. But that in addition to that, there is an enormous amount of anti-Zionist delegitimization of Israel going on, and which basically says that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, which is what anti-Zionism at its core means. And so the Palestinian flag has a mixed reception to many Jewish people, I'd say by far the majority.
And the kafir as well.
And the kafir, And that even if its intention is to show solidarity with the sort of brutality of what's happening in Gaza, it is read as, given we're in a war between Israel and Gaza, it is read as a support for Hamas and Hamas's mandate to destroy the state of Israel. So that is how...
But it is. No,
so that is how...
Some people do think that, and that comes to my point, right?
But you've just conflated it. You've just said in Israel's war in Gaza, with Gaza.
Hamas.
With Gaza. You didn't say Hamas.
Well, I'm
you
saying
said
it now.
Gaza.
I'm saying
No,
it
but
now.
that's really important because you are conflating the issue of what this struggle is all about. And I think that's the problem that,
I'm not saying I'm right or wrong, Louise. I'm saying that is how it is experienced by the majority. And if we are concerned, like I was, when Black Lives Matter movement came out, and people would hold up the All Lives Matter sign, and they would say, I'm just affirming our basic equality. And the black community rightly said, by saying that, my experience of it is that you're denying our very unique claim to a history of racism. We are listening closely to their experience, to their reception, not to the intent. And I'm just saying that is how it is often received. I'm not saying it's right or wrong.
Yeah,
I don't find it personally that problematic.
So, and I think this is the nub of the problem that often we find ourselves in, that one might say that's a mistaken judgment or an ill-founded feeling, but if the feeling is as intense as it is, what weight should it be given? And this is where I'm trying to balance the intensity and genuine nature of the feeling versus Brook's invocation of the need for bravery in the time given the issues. I mean, how brave are we with each other and those who... I know I keep going back to the history of your community's experience, but to say, you've just got to be a bit brave when people are saying atrocious things, wouldn't
well, you
it? But that doesn't seem to me like a fair or adequate response.
But I mean, a lot of people aren't brave, are they? I mean, people stay in the closet, they stay in unhappy marriages for years, and people aren't brave. And that's okay as well, but hopefully there's enough brave people that will step up and take that space and make their voices heard. And it's interesting because I was sitting here thinking, and it's not in any way correlation, but there may be people in the room that have an issue with me as well, because I am a lesbian, I am homosexual, I go against their faith in religion, but I am just a person. I'm just trying to exist like all of us in this space, and that's all you want, really. I know it's so bloody naive, but
fear seems to be.
Yeah, fear.
Fear is a big thing. People afraid of their existence being questioned in front of me. Fear about a legitimate concern for tens of thousands of people being swept away as not significant. Fear about stepping outside. I think you were talking about works you might produce talking about the remains of Indigenous people not being shown in some gallery. Is that right? You were saying that?
Well, they are the themes, but I think the most important thing, if we're here to talk about art and politics, and is art political, etc., is that it's not always real. It's often fantasy, right? Or it's drawn from real events. And I think that that's confronting in itself. And I think if we're talking about bravery, being a gay man myself, I just remember growing up here in Sydney and, we talked before about how you get home, etc. But I think all of these experiences that we have, regardless what they are that we're talking about, they feed into our practice as creative people, regardless if we're making the work or writing the work or working with writers. And as you say, absolutely, people are going to turn up and go to this session or not, or why are the people at this session. All I have to say is I live in Colombia at the moment. And if I look at the kind of art that's being made there, you have FARC and other kind of very incredibly dangerous groups of people that still control the country, and also what's happening in South America and Venezuela, and how it controls artists and who can and can't say things. I think we are, and I don't want to, the word privilege is kind of like the word trigger, right? So I'm not trying to make a big deal out of it, but we are quite privileged to be able to sit here and have this safe conversation in a way.
But Violette, you self-censor yourself all the time. You were telling us that you you run through
We all
things
do
you might
though, don't
say.
we? Yeah,
no, but
well, I do
you were talking
act-
about it, talking to your partner, testing lines, writing them down. I mean, how much of that? And then we'll open it up to questions, by the way, if you're wanting to do that, just so people know. That must. I mean, how much of that is that your daily life now, where you're second guessing everything you say and do?
Yeah, like quite a bit. I think maybe less now. I think across the last 8 to 10 months or whatever it was, less so because I've just sort of come to this place of I feel like I can see into the future. I feel like I know where I want to be on certain issues. I feel like the sense of doing what is right and correct and what I know to be, true outweighs the short-term consequences and things like that. And once you kind of embrace the consequences of what you're going to say, you sort of become untouchable, because then it's like, well, go for it. That's...
And are you self-censoring too? And Emile, just before I go to Gil?
Yeah, I'd say so, yeah.
Right.
Can I just say one thing? What I always keep very close to my heart, what would Sydney be like without Mardi Gras? Okay?
Boring.
What if those people hadn't kept on fighting and we keep on fighting? What would Sydney be like? Bloody boring. So maybe that's, that's actually why we have to keep on being brave.
Yeah, clarify one thing, and then if anybody wants to join the conversation, I'm not sure, I think there's a microphone there, it's just going to move into the light. If you just want to move across, I'd ask you, please, don't make a speech, because we're not making speeches here, we're having a conversation. Have a question, but also think about how you phrase it with regard to the people in the room. Not just here, but more generally. Yes, Emile?
Just a quick... I think one thing that we've agreed on a lot of things, but that, we self-censor and people self-censor, but fundamentally we need to accept being uncomfortable. I think we're all in favour of that, and that the power of art to be able to make people uncomfortable, to express the human condition in ways that make people uncomfortable and transgress boundaries is of fundamental importance, and that sits at the core of what art does. And the boundaries, and wherever they are, wherever we land on consent, but transgressing boundaries and the freedom to make people uncomfortable and to think in ways that they haven't is absolutely key.
Well, that's the terrible irony of it, isn't it? If we're self-censoring ourselves, the one thing that art is opposed to in life is censorship.
And actually,
but we haven't talked, I'm sorry, Violetta,
but
we haven't talked at all about the way institutions are cancelling artists.
Yeah,
With
and
the-
we'll say the libraries.
We haven't
Need a
the
second
libraries.
conversation.
I mean,
So,
the
do you want to talk?
councils-
We've got some people lining up for
Well,
questions.
let's hear from them. But I
But
think
that's-
Can I
it's a
just say the very quick thing, because it's in line with that of like, both Emile and I very honestly admitted that we both came to this a little bit afraid of like what that would mean if people, those consequences. But I do think, might not know the answers, but one of the key things is to have conversations, and one of the worst things that companies can do is to silence conversations, either by firing people or not letting artists speak to donors, not letting artists speak to the board, not opening up the conversation, because it's like a permaculture tenet to start from what's working, and I think there is actually a lot that people agree on. If we start there, we can make better.
And if we get
headway.
a question, you might want to say a
fine.
bit more about that, Louise. Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. It's been a very interesting discussion. My question is really kind of to Brook, but to anyone else who wants to answer. It's just I'm very familiar with Brook's work being kind of institutionally provocative, and I'm wondering if that's a byproduct of the work you want to create, or the goal, or part of the goal of the work in itself is to provoke the institution, and maybe that can extend to the rest of the group as well.
Thank you. What's your name?
Oh, I'm Simpson.
Hi, Simpson.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think that number one, I don't think being an artist, I never thought it was social political. I just wanted to insert into my reality and my community the things that have been missing. And so that's the silencing of my mother's side of the family, which is Indigenous Australian, and the kind of legacies which are so deeply invisible. And even though we all might sit here going, oh, we know about Indigenous people now. No, we know a slither of that. And so we end up being, as in artists, we end up being historians, and dentists end up being dentists. And it was kind of funny what you were saying before, but I totally disagree with that, because I wouldn't want to work on your teeth. I don't have that knowledge.
Yes, you would. Come on. Come on.
No,
I'll get in there with
sincerely,
you.
right? So
Louise would.
Give him a new bridge. Give him a new bridge.
Like, 10 years later, a work I made back 10 years ago, it's where it was, and it really needed to happen. And if it has a political, social ramification, that's great. But I'm not... I didn't go out deliberately to do that. I just think that it just needed to be visible.
Could I just add one very quickly to say on the question of dentists, we've just and I know he's persona non grata, but Woody Allen wrote the best script ever, the best piece ever about when the Impressionists were dentists, and I recommend you all read it. It is hysterical.
And I'd just like to apologise to any dentists in the audience. If you're feeling a bit put upon,
do not feel persecuted.
Geopolitical opinions, yes, please come forward. If you just offer briefly your name and your question.
Yep. Laura, was wondering about art being sort of almost co-opted by politics, in the sense that if you're trying to already make a point or tell a specific story and someone sort of butts in almost or reads a different kind of political point into it, how do you work around that? How do you feel about that?
Who wants to have a crack at that?
Can I just say one thing about that? I think that often within arts, as in visual arts organisations, even non-for-profits, etc., you'll have board members. And often board members are quite incredible, or they're quite ignorant, quite frankly. And then they will create a situation and they will hire and fire people within certain organisations, or they will influence or not influence artists, depending on their own personal opinions. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
You put that very mildly.
That's about the
Thank you very much.
That's a huge issue, which I think people are starting, when we got our group together, it's a question about how do you have a common perspective for the entity if it is an entity?
It's about governance, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about
rather
governance.
than people sitting around table saying, my personal
Absolutely.
preference or opinion is this.
Yeah.
Violette, do you want to have something of that? And I know Emil's got some views on that question.
You go for it. I think you read
Okay,
it.
you go.
I didn't have anything.
No, she didn't have a
to
view. I just stopped her in.
Oh, it was just to respond to your question about how politics can co-opt artworks. For me, that is, a mark of a great artwork, if it can open up a number of different political interpretations. Obviously, if the artwork's meaning is closed down by a particular sort of politics, particularly when it comes from groups in power, that's really problematic. But when politics, that's the question of when, how do you read an artwork? Do you read just the politics of the intent of the author, or does the work stand on itself? And then it's a sort of, entity in the world in which it can be interpreted by whoever comes along. And I think the more interpretations a work has, in a sense, the richer it is. And to go back to Caravaggio, he may have had that intent at the time, but the reason he's lasted so long is that we all read our own experience and our own humanity into his work.
Because also he's a bloody good painter.
Because he's a bloody good painter.
And look, no artist ever controls the meeting.
You don't control.
Let's have one more question, I think. We only have time for one more, then we have to wrap up and pick up on that point of Louise's.
Hi, my name's Ian. Thank you
Ian.
for the conversation. I guess, Mike, I wanted to throw a question to all of you to just sort of comment to the role that philanthropy and or funding has. It talks to Brook's conversation about power. Emil, you were talking about artists, visual artists making an artistic statement. I'm thinking about Mike Parr being cancelled by Anna Schwartz after what was an overtly, artistic act. And Gil, I know that Mardi Gras had issues with Pride and Protest, and there's been all sorts of negotiations around the power that the funding body or the philanthropist brings. So I guess that's my question about that relationship.
Well, it's probably the reason why we're not talking about it, because we probably don't feel safe to. Maybe, I don't know.
Because of the vulnerability you have in your program too.
And we,
Can you just explain for those of you who might know the context exactly what that reference was to?
I probably won't.
Okay.
That's okay.
Look, I'm going to go out on a limb then, but I feel like if I had $2 million to hand STC October last year or November last year, then this would not have been an issue. And that is like a fundamental part of why the conversation turned out to be what it was, like the philanthropy, the donors pulling the money in what is an industry that is gutted of funding because of the last decade of funding cuts to the arts as well, has put companies in an incredibly precarious spot.
You recognise their vulnerability there.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yes, but I also would say to arts organisations that they're talking out of both sides of their mouth if they're saying we can't afford to lose these donors, but we're not doing enough to actually access the audiences out there from different backgrounds that don't feel that the theatre is for them, and they don't feel the orchestra is for them, or don't feel the ballet is for them. I was in a show that had unsubtitled Farsi, Arabic, Mandarin, and there wasn't a big enough effort, in my humble opinion, to access those audiences. Yeah. So, look, I don't run a company, I'm sure it's really hard, but diversify your funding streams and maybe we're not in such precarious positions.
And I suppose I just want to comment on the pride and protest thing. I mean, they're actually incredibly important parts of our community because they are activists. They're young, they're passionate, and they give a shit. And they work really hard to actually ensure that people hear those voices, and that's really important. But they play hardball.
Emile?
I mean, it's an incredibly tricky relationship on being on the board of arts organisations with having donors. You wish you didn't need to, but you've got donors, and they're obviously free to put their money where they want. And that's where it gets back to that point about, principles and transparency. And the more that can be worked through upfront, and this is a great moment of reworking through some of those things, the more a donor comes in and they're informed about what the principles are of the organisation, and I think they're less likely to pull their money out, because they'll only do so if those principles are transgressed. But they've been, this is what I've enjoyed about this moment. It's been a moment to sort of work through what those principles are.
I might be naive, but I think there should be some kind of compact with donors to say these are the boundaries within
exactly.
If you want to give, don't expect to be able to
control this or that.
You may not want to give, but I don't think you can. It's not fair to try and push that lever.
But I think that also it goes beyond the donor, because we're thinking about donors being multi-millionaire, billionaires. I mean, for me, from my perspective as a visual artist, donors are also the punters, right? It's about us going to pay $30 to go see a show somewhere. And I remember Andre Serrano's Piss Christ was on display at the National Gallery of Australia about 15 years ago, I think.
Oh, longer than that. Tim Potts was the gallery director that cancelled it.
And it was actually communities from diverse backgrounds, I mean, mainly Christian and other communities, which had their own valid right to go up there and want to, cancel that show. The interesting thing about it was that my friends who worked on that show and who were curators on that show, they were getting death threats. Yeah. So when we are talking about donors, when we're talking about money, I don't think we can forget about everyday people, right, as donors as well. And I think that the way in which that there is misunderstanding. Obviously, those people don't understand Andre Serrano's work. He is actually a very Catholic person. As a very ritualised, as a Latin American person, it was like Australians from whatever backgrounds did not understand his work. And I think if they were educated about his work, they would probably go, oh my God, this is really highly ritualistic. We really want to go and support it. And I think that's what it's about.
We had an event with Andre after the, the NGV episode, and I thought it was great. His fly was open the whole time. And I just thought, I couldn't, I'm sorry, I know it's a small detail, but it was very entertaining.
Small but important. Look, we've run out of time, and of course we were not going to solve this issue, but I hope for everybody in the circle in the room that we've had an opportunity to explore in good faith the nature of the issues, and I think we have drawn some things out. I'm conscious, Louise, you did put your finger on one of the great problems at the moment, which I think almost closed the circle back to where Brook started with the risks in being an artist in this environment. And you're talking about people being cancelled and things like that. Do you just want to say a word on that before we break?
And I think I think it's a governance question, isn't it? It's a governance question, really. It's about what, the relationship of the artists who are pressing. We've seen it, artists pressing, companies to take a stand on particular issues, whatever they are, boards wanting to be risk averse. Where does management stand? What's the responsibility to artists? What's the responsibility to donors? Making sure that donors understand, the ethics and the values of the organisation, seeing they're compatible. It's really a governance question.
And then also the media, how the media works with it as well.
The media.
So as we come to go, I think we've got some clues to it, but I still think that someone needs to be able to say, who is it that's deciding where some of these boundaries of expectation or control lie? How do you balance audience, donors, artists, administration, the people who have to find the funding and all of those things together so that we can sustain that in the absence of adequate resources? How do we acknowledge the fear and vulnerability that's there in a way that is sometimes for whole communities and sometimes down to individuals? And how do we find in the acknowledgement of that the courage as a community to engage with the unexpected that can open up the world in new ways so that we don't just remain stuck in the kind of places we are at the moment? So that we might find a dentist playing the third cello holding forth
with
outlandish
a passionate
views
pro-abortion
where-
position.
while the choir sings in the library. I don't know, whatever the kind of...
But also there are many artists who are not within an institutional framework,
Yes,
right? And I
yes.
think that we are talking a lot about institutionalisation here.
Yes.
And there are a lot
Yeah.
of creative people who are firmly outside of
Outside.
that. And I think that's right across
And
the
they
board.
can find their own spaces. Look,
And dentists.
everybody, can you please join me in thanking Violette, Louise, Brook, Gil, and Emil. Thank you. And I hope whatever else you're going to, you enjoy.
Can I just say on behalf, I shouldn't speak on behalf of us as participants, but just thank you,
Thanks,
Simon, for
Simon.
wonderful
Thank you,
moderating.
thank you.
And to the FODI organisation, which has been wonderful to work with, professional,
Thank you, Louise.
efficient, and so solicitous of our well-being. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
This session was recorded live at Carriage Works Sydney in August 2024. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit ethics.org.au to find out more. Thank you.